It's the O Show, the show with the O. It's the O Show, the show with the O. We talk and talk and talk and talk, then we talk some more. It's the O Show, the show with the O. It's the O Show, the show with the O. It's about unconditional self-acceptance, yeah. And sometimes we discover things we did not know. At the O Show, at the O Show.
Hello and welcome to the O Show. I'm your host, Oriana Fox, and we're here today to talk about femininity. 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 Have I said it enough times that the word has lost all meaning? Good. That's where I'm at with it. What is femininity anyway? According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, the definition of femininity is 1, the qualities and nature of the female sex. Well, that could be anything. 2, effeminacy. That could apply to men. I know lots of effeminate men. We have one here on the show today. 3, women, womankind. Too broad. What is femininity? They used to help out by giving an example of how to use the term in a sentence. It used to say, quote, she managed to become a female CEO without sacrificing her femininity, unquote. But the American feminist Alison Siegel tweeted about the sentence being sexist and stirred up a feminist furor. The dictionary responded by removing it. Feminist battle won. Is it a feminist battle won? There's something quite juicy about the sentence, provocative, worth talking about, methinks. That's why I've named today's episode, Without Sacrificing Her Femininity. But what is femininity? I'm still none the wiser. Is femininity a cause to rally around, to protect and defend, to bring all who identify with it together? Or will it tear us apart? Is femininity confining or empowering? Are traditionally feminine qualities only useful as lubricants for social bonds, to catch a mate or raise a family? According to queer theorist Judith Butler, to challenge the notion of femininity is the consummately feminine act. To challenge the notion of femininity is the consummately feminine act. Well, if that's the case, we've got a supremely feminine lineup of guests for you today. We have the erotic but ethical entrepreneur, Sam Roddick. Erotic Sam Roddick. We have the eloquent and elegant moving image maker and performance artist, Michelle Williams Gamaker. We have the fiercely effeminate and fabulous performance artist, Nando Messias. And last, but certainly by no means least, we have the defiant, doesn't take shit domestic worker, Marissa Begonia. Let's give them a round of applause. I am over the moon to have each of them on the show today because I really respect all of them and admire all of them. Each of them conforms to conventional femininity in some way, but equally they defy and refute it. Personally, My relationship to femininity has always been ambivalent. Now, don't get me wrong, ambivalence is not wishy-washy. It can hurt. It's a big yes followed by a big no. When I came into this world, I was wanted, and wanted especially for being a girl. The no's came later. Ultimately, I think that being feminine has contributed to my shyness, my shame-proneness, that persistent feeling that I'm just somehow not good enough. Femininity is responsible for some of my deepest injuries, but equally, it's my saving grace. When it comes to femininity, I can't live with it, and I can't live without it. And I think each of the guests today, although they come from very different perspectives, share that sentiment. I like to think of femininity as a little bit like the religion I was raised with. I like to pick and choose which aspects I identify with and practice. I like to maintain those parts that benefit me and disregard the ones that don't. When it comes to femininity, I'd like to bake my cake and eat it too. I love to wear beautiful clothes and get made up for the cameras, but I don't always like the attention that that brings. I want to be attractive for certain people. I want to be perceived as feminine by certain people. But unfortunately, with these things, you really can't pick and choose. With gender identity, as with organized religion, it's a collective endeavor. If your internal sense isn't mirrored by the external world, you'll miss out on those good feelings that belonging to a religion or a gender can bring. And for those of us with a feminine sensibility, this can be all the more troubling because we're the ones who are supposed to be keeping everyone together. We're supposed to put others before ourselves. And if we don't, we open ourselves to accusations of narcissism. But they'll accuse us of that anyway. In this, I'm conventional. I not only admit to being narcissistic, but I'm really happy being the primary caregiver to my children. I don't want the pressures of being the breadwinner, although I do want success in the world of work. I want to earn my keep. And like many of you, my sense of self-worth is diminished if I'm not having enough of it all. So things being as they are, with binary gender norms seemingly prevailing, I'm one of the lucky ones. I'm really privileged. As I said, I was really wanted for being a girl. But having only brothers meant that when puberty came along, and for me, I was an early bloomer, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I didn't know what hit me. Menstruation, strange appendages, no thank you. If I have to have breasts, I want them to be small, and I hid them under bulky sweatshirts, even in summer. My burgeoning sexuality was the gift that kept on taking until I learned to play it safer or value myself more. I didn't really come into my femininity until maybe my late 20s or early 30s. And actually, maybe it's something I'm still working on. But with maturity, my sexuality has brought lots of yeses. Yes, yes, yes. My gender identity is so central to my life that to give you just a snippet doesn't suffice for the whole truth. I'm far too complicated for that. Repeat after me.
I'm far too complicated for that.
Yes, indeed, you are. And so is this topic, which is why challenging and cherishing femininity has been so central to my life's work. And I think today's episode is going to be a climax in that process. In fact, I think my guests are going to ensure that it's multiply climactic. So, without further ado, let's begin. Speaking of orgasms, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my first guest, who is a pleasure provocateur, a passionate artist, an outspoken activist. She comes from a long line of disobedient women. She's perhaps best known for combining business pursuits with socio-political campaigning, because she opened a sex shop called Coco de Mer with an activist arm called Bondage for Freedom, which worked to end sex trafficking. Please put your hands together for Sam Roddick. So great to have you on the show.
Oh, my total pleasure. I'm excited.
All right, so my first question is, what inspired you to start Coco de Mer?
Well, there was two. There was the one reason which I never tell anybody, and then the reason which is true, but not the basis of like how I really initiated my own inquiry around kind of sex and a cultural aspiration around sex. So the truth is, I was doing a 25 quid Kabbalah course, correspondence, and I was really interested. I've always been interested in esoteric kind of symbolism and cross-cultural kind of myths and so forth. And in the 25 quid course, I aced the first kind of part, the foundation, which is called Malkuth, and it's about our planet, our senses, and the second part is called Yesod, which is actually connected to our sexuality. You're supposed to write a magical diary. And when I did Yesod, and it's all about your subconscious, I went fucking mental. And the reason I went mental, because I started actually writing a lot of angry text. And it was very kind of like violently self kind of defacing. And I realized that while I had quite a sexual appetite, I also had a lot of sexual anger to do with all various different wounds that I had. And I literally looked at the diary and I was like, nobody can read this. I am not sending this off to the 25 quid correspondence teacher. And I basically realized I had a huge issue. And like most of the people that I have known in all of the years that I have worked within the sex industry and around sex workers' rights, all of the people I have ever met have come from like a sexual wound. So they have all in some way been kind of sexually damaged, but there are those who are basically repeating those damage and those who are kind of using their damage as a way to heal themselves and others. And that's true across the board in terms of every kind of like professional within the sex industry, from my perspective. So I kind of then went on a pursuit around like, who am I and what is my own personal relationship to my own sense of sexual empowerment. And I read this book called The History of Whores by Nikki Roberts. It is genius. She is an ex-sex worker, but it's probably the best researched kind of book I have ever read on the history of prostitution as far back as recorded, so like right down to the Sumerian times, and cross-cultural. And that just blew my mind away, and it made me realize that fundamentally we have not progressed sexually, we have digressed. Because when you actually look at how women occupy the world of sex and our cultural role within it, you start to realize that it's become more and more and more violent as like the ages, and it's like, as you can see today, we still haven't addressed things like sexual compassion, sexual respect, sexual care, sexual safety. These aren't words that we are really in our kind of vocabulary. So then I was like, shit me, like, you know, I want to find out who I am. But instead of actually going to a therapist, which I should have, I decided to do what I've always done, which is get political about it, which is another way to avoid yourself, but also at the same time deal with yourself, right? It's a way of inquiry without necessarily having to kind of face your pain. But eventually I had to do a lot of therapy, but within the...
Facing your pain is overrated.
Yeah, it's very overrated, like, but it helps. But so then from that, I got involved with sex workers' rights. I started volunteering, like I was really 23, 24. Started volunteering for various different prostitute collectives. At the time, I was the only kind of volunteer who was not a sex worker, and I got very much entrenched in that kind of political stratosphere. And then from then, I started kind of realizing that our culturally, we did not have, you know, a place where we could discuss that discuss sexuality, discuss our own sexuality, and also kind of push society into a place which was thinking more about it from an aspirational perspective. So I came up with Coco de Mer. I didn't know who my customer was because at the first time I was the first sex shop globally. Like there was Agent Provocateur, but that had like 99% knickers and one whip. But like I was orifice friendly. So like in terms of the market, I didn't know who was going to occupy it. I made presumptions, but my market was completely different from my presumptions. The only people I really did not cater for was really people who were younger than 25, right? 25, a little bit, 35, a lot more, 45, we're getting really strong here, 55, up until 80 was my clientele, right? 85, couple of raging 90-year-olds, I'm telling you, and women, because women's libido goes up after a certain age, after menopause is finished and hitting their 70s, mid-70s, you know, it releases their sexuality. That's why you've got so many horny grannies that you might not know. We've got a long life with sex, right? Like it is a part of our vitality. It's a part of our existence. Like we've got a long life with eating and food and breathing. Sex is so, like this is how we're born, right? Like this is what we do. We're like born in a lot of ways to enjoy our sexual kind of characters, whoever they may be, or how many you might have. I don't know. That's good. But so no, I didn't realise I was going to open up a shop. But when I did, the weird thing was having to deal with customers. And it was really my customers that healed me. They were the ones that were the interface coming to me with all of their problems. And I did say that I was like the greatest confession booth. This greatest confession booth within like London, and I had heard thousands and thousands and thousands of confessions, but through people confessing to me about their own sexual issues, their own sexual desires, their own concerns, their own insecurities, I had like this amazing mirror that was kind of like so gently kind of opening me up like a closed clam Venus trap. And then I just like, you know, like, it's because sex is only as liberated as you are internally, right? So anyway.
Since it was kind of a confession booth,
yeah,
in your kind of expert, personal and professional estimation, how would you characterize feminine sexuality?
All-encompassing. I think feminine sexuality has an appetite. It's ferocious in its appetite. It is like, it's very interesting because it is actually more confident than we would socially perceive it to be. This is just the people who were walking through my doors. There is a sense of like independence, I find, to the female sexuality. Or the feminine kind of sexuality. I think everybody occupies a feminine and a masculine, so I don't think you can characterize it in gender. It's much more like in reciprocity. Like so in that kind of sense that it's like I feel like the feminine sexuality needs a bigger platform to take charge, if you see what I mean, because like I feel like actually the male sexuality or patriarchal sexuality, let's not even call it male because it's not male, right? It's bad teaching and there's good teaching. And within that, we're both, right? Like we're both kind of feminine and masculine. And you can see that in the vulnerability of it. That the problem with our social kind of patriarchal expectations of sex is that it should not be emotional, or it is not emotional. It's kind of disassociated from us. It's like a sport, and it's actually not. It's a reflection of our total sum of who we are as an expression. So our sexual kind of expression is very much linked to our subconscious. It's very much linked to the sum total of all the experiences we had. It's more closer to the world of dreams than it is to the world of rationale. So it's kind of interesting, and it can be trained, like by porn or by triggering. So it's kind of like holds this kind of hidden kind of character. So I love female sexuality. I find it very forceful and powerful and juicy and desirable, and emotional, warm, wet, delicious. Am I selling it?
Yeah.
I like masculine sexuality too. I'm into both. That's why my shop was very 50-50. I've changed my whole perspective on men having that shop in a good way.
Sounds good.
Yeah, yeah.
Just one last thing. I heard that you were censored from Instagram.
Oh, yeah.
And I myself have been censored from Vimeo. So I wanted to
right.
ask you how you responded to that.
I set up a new account and started putting even more sexual stuff on it with a different email.
They didn't take you out again?
You know what? I felt so disenfranchised and I felt so betrayed. But because basically it was my vagina cornicing that I personally don't. People say, yeah, that does look like a vagina. I was like, how many vaginas have you seen? It looks like, Georgia O'Keeffe vagina, which is like an interpretation of vagina. There are people ask me, is that your vagina? I'm like, what the fuck? It's like, it's amazing how little people have seen vaginas. Like, I'm really shocked by it. It's like, I have no idea. Like, yeah. I responded, I did lots of talks. It went in the press. I kind of ended up kind of challenging with a group of other women and people about what the parameters of banning were, because it seemed to me like they were banning a lot of political kind of perspective on sexuality rather than actually kind of sexual nudity. Like,
Yes,
so
loads of sexual nudity
none
on
of it.
Vimeo.
And it just,
No problem with that.
it was a really interesting kind of perception view, saying, sex is really interesting because there's a lot of attraction, but actually there's a lot of repulsion. And so it seemed to me like that sexual kind of dynamic, or like that creative, social, sexual, political kind of conversation that was happening through like visuals was actually being censored because it's confrontational, it's emotionally confrontational, and it's like not like a shiny, perfect arse in parcel string.
Right. Thank you so much for that. I'm a big admirer of the moving image and performance work of my next guest. Her work is a little bit like mine in that it blurs the line between art and life. It revolves around mainly female or genderqueer characters, and it's inspired by her fascination with and identification with characters from fiction who she's also critical of, and she responds to it with docu-fictional remakes. So let's please give a warm welcome to Michelle Williams Gamaker. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Just to let everyone in the audience and all those people watching, if they're not familiar with your work, to let them know a little bit about it and also how it relates to your identity.
Okay, well, in terms of my identity, I'm a brown woman in my kind of late 30s. That's a starting point. Who has always used performance, and initially back in the early days of my performance and filmmaking, I tried to look for characters that I could identify with, but back in the 80s and 90s, there was such a paucity of characters of colour on television or in film. So one day I stumbled across a film that some of you may have seen called Black Narcissus from 1947. It's by Powell and Pressburger, and I got completely interested in a character called Kanchi, who was this Indian woman who was quite lascivious and sexualized, but with no agency. She was essentially a dancing girl, beggar maid. The irony of that is that she was played by a white woman, and of course I realized that fairly quickly, that that's what I was watching. But in my early performances, I quite crudely tried to become Kanchi and work out how to find a space for women of colour with agency. So And in terms of complexity around characters, I suppose that's where queerness comes in, which is also part of my identity. So the genderqueer characters or the female characters I look for hopefully don't have to be consigned to a traditional telling of their histories.
What do you think fictional activism, that's your term for what you do, what do you think it does for you, for the performers, and for the world?
Part of my goal is that I'm only one half of the story. I think that I'm so interested in the stories of other people that I do ask individuals who work with me to kind of meet me halfway in this docu-fictional space. So the fictional activism is so much about thinking about rewriting endings for characters. So I want alternative structures. That means that we don't have to, as women, fail or fall in this kind of doomed maiden scenario. And I think we already know that. But I think that I'm trying to write characters that respond to something of the contemporary or current conditions that we experience. So if I take Kanchi, she's a character that I've revamped, if you like, by asking someone who identifies as genderqueer to play that role. And they take on Kanchi, but they move it on in ways that are probably unimaginable to people from the 20th century, but they're completely imaginable to 20th century thinkers. So that's sort of part of this fictional activist realm. I think it's a term that's ever evolving, but I'd like it to really create this body of fictional characters that are actually more real than documentary, in the sense that there's like, we're already in this post-truth phase, and in a way, the space of fiction is as good as it gets for me to kind of explore it.
So is there something therapeutic about how you work with people?
I certainly explore parts of my identity through I explore parts of my identity through the characters I'm writing, but I'm also working with individuals who I can learn from, because I'm not casting myself so much anymore. I'm really casting people that I think can bring something quite special to the roles I'm writing. So the therapeutic aspect is learning about myself through a fictional mode. And that's not to say that everything that I do relates to me, although I'm probably going to reveal that in a minute. It's more that the co-writing or the sharing, because even when I write something, I'm also putting the words of somebody else back into the fictional form. So I wouldn't want it to be an imposition, you know. So, you know, writing something is a conversation. It's not meant to be, say it like this. Yeah.
Yeah. But in your early work, I know you used yourself a lot more, and you had alter egos. Can you say something about your alter ego?
So yeah, the alter egos is an interesting one, because I suppose I've often tried to escape the conditions of being me. And the reason for that is that it's hard being a woman of colour in cultural spaces or in the world. And I did create a character called Violet Colbeau, who continues to be an alter ego, but she's developed. I think when I first developed her, I was living in the Netherlands, and at the time I was constantly asked, where are you from, or, you know, what's your origin? And I got quite exhausted by that, so I invented Violet to basically have a completely different backstory. And Violet happened to share something of my history, in that she was a daughter of an immigrant, and that she just seeks a home. She looks to seek a home in a foreign space. And right at the very beginning, Violet was this purple morph suit coloured figure, and I was pregnant at the time, so I had this really large bump, and I used to teach my students in this purple morph suit and do performance workshops with them, and that seems to not be relevant anymore because there's so many other Violets out there that can take on part of this question around diasporic histories, and when your mother lands somewhere and calls a place home, what are you left with and what is your legacy? Yeah.
Really good question. I really want to talk a bit about your film Brown Queers. Can you say, how that film came about and what it's about?
Yeah, I'll try to give a sense of what Brown Queers is about. It's a conversation that happened in 2016 with 4 people, Krishna Ista, Katie Jalili, Natasha Lal, and Umba Gori. And there are 4 individuals who identify as being brown and queer, as the title suggests, but they also told me that in the queer scene that they often experienced marginalisation or, the hierarchies and privileges of the white queer world, but also of, I guess, if any of them chose to represent as femme, they were also sometimes attacked under those conditions. So Brown Queers is really a conversation that happens and is documented by those individuals in their current state in that moment. They've already moved on. So that's the kind of joy for me of what queerness opens up. They can't say that they're one thing. They explicitly choose to be genderqueer because they don't even want to kind of lock down their sexuality, because in so doing it gets too fixed or too entrenched. So it was about me learning from them about what being queer is in 2000 and now,
Okay. Well, I'm so glad you're here to talk about that, because this show was really inspired by a previous episode I did on female masculinity. And in the discussion during that episode, it came up, this kind of, imbalance in the queer and LGBT community, how femme representing people are, somehow of a lesser status or treated differently, and also, minorities, people of color being treated differently in queer spaces. And so I'm really happy that you're here to address that, because it comes up in your work. And I'm just wondering if you have any personal experience, like have you experienced that kind of
I think I must have over the years, but I could just give a recent example, because I'm still reeling from it or recovering from it. That I also work at Goldsmiths, which most people would believe to be a super progressive space, which it absolutely is. But I was recently denied access into one part of the campus, despite showing my staff card. And it was humiliating, because I had 30 students with me, and yet I couldn't gain access. And there are complications to this story. It was ahead of the strike at Goldsmiths, but it was also, I had to think about, if that card wasn't enough, what then is going on in that denial of my access? So one could be, race, perceived gender, age, and potentially my feminist, and I rather, what's really galling about that moment is my older white colleague, who's a man, came to join me to basically reiterate the same thing and show his card, and then all of a sudden everyone was allowed in. And that one was a killer for me, because I thought, what more do I need to do in this space? I give a lot. What more do you want? And I just feel that it's, rather than tone down my feminist in an institutional space, I'd rather ramp it up, even though it actually works against me, and I'll continue to do that for as long as I want to do it. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, because I know that you're married and you have a child, I'm just wondering, do you feel you fit in the queer community? I know you identify that way, but have you ever felt like, because of those two factors, that you don't, I don't know, gel?
I guess I'm quite cautious about, I'm not hiding anything, but what I feel is that with marriage and a child, there comes a certain heteronormative privilege that I'm living. So within my circle of friends, some of whom are queer, I feel quite supported, but I would absolutely understand if people didn't get me in relation to how I live. But that is absolutely fine with me because I never claimed to get myself in that respect. And being married or having a child that's perhaps a heteronormative structure that I performed on myself, and we're talking about years ago. But that doesn't mean that we play one life. I think that we play several lives, or we have several truths. And in a way, I've just come to accept that without trying to impose a label upon myself, because I've tried it. I'm lesbian or I'm bi, or they don't work. And where queerness at least contributes is to a complexity of positions. And, you know, I'm not very comfortable in the heteronormative or, you know, non-queer world. If I'm at a school drop-off, I feel like I'm performing being a mother that is absolutely a farce to me. It's like, yes, she didn't sleep well. You know, like I don't know what I'm supposed to do other than play at that. So if I don't fit anywhere, that's also okay. But where I do feel most comfortable is talking about queerness within my work, because that's quite a natural continuation.
And it's an open space that you control, so
Yeah, I guess so.
So, thank you so much. My third guest has a PhD in effeminacy. His work utilizes dance, theater, and public intervention, combining beautiful images with a fierce critique of gender. Please put your hands together for Nando Macias. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for inviting me to be on the show.
So I want you to tell everyone about your recent work and, the Sissy series.
Okay, the Sissy series. It's interesting. It started, and I've told myself this is going to be the last time I ever tell this story, and it's a lie. It's a big lie. I always find myself telling the story again, and I feel it's kind of my mission somehow to tell this story. But it started with something that happened to me really. It's something very personal. I was coming back home from the theater. I was dressed up and turning a corner onto the street where I live. I was met by a gang of 8 young men, and I was attacked, physically attacked. That was something that obviously was very traumatic, but that started a process of examination. I was doing my PhD at the time, so I was reading lots of queer theory. And there's something that Judith Butler wrote that I kind of latched onto. She says that when one is touched by violence, one has not only the opportunity, but the responsibility, the duty to do something about that violence which has touched them, in order to kind of help ameliorate the lives of other people who also suffer that violence. So I took that as my mission, in a way, but also as a way to pick myself up and kind of, you said something really interesting that maybe we can go back to later about the political being a way to escape yourself, but also to go into yourself. That's something that I relate to in many ways. So that's when my work turned a political, there was a political turn to my work. I went into studio and started to examine physically what was it in my body that attracted the negative attention of a group of young men. And I could see that if I was really very direct and objective about that, I could see that it was, for instance, the way that I walked. It was the way that I was dressed, even though that is an appendage. You know, the nails, the makeup, the high heel shoes, I can take those away. There's reasons why I choose not to, and we can come back to that later, but the walk is something that I realized in studio I could not change, that I was trying to be someone else, and that was impossible. And then the next step after that was realizing that I didn't want to change. Why would I want to change? I was doing to myself, to my own body, what that group of young men did to me. Basically, I went into the studio trying to tell myself, you have to conform, you have to walk like a man, basically. And realized that there is no solution for me. I cannot do that. It's impossible, but I am also unwilling to do that. It's not something I'm going to do to myself. So the solution then became to turn the volume up, to become more myself rather than less myself. Rather than trying to become invisible and to erase the difference, the traces that make me stand out in public, I realized that I could, the solution for me is to become hyper-visible, so more visible. So to exaggerate the walk, to wear higher heels, to put more makeup on, more perfume on, and that's my mission. Because there's no escaping, basically, of becoming visible, of being visible. I cannot hide that. That's part of my condition as an individual. And then choosing to embrace that becomes a political choice, I guess. So the work, the Sissi series, is about that. The second in that series is called The Sissi's Progress. And in that piece, I took the audience out onto the very spot where I was attacked. There was a moment of silence, and I was out on the streets with a marching band following me, with helium balloons, a ball gown, and that to me was a representation of that analogy that I had envisaged, that I had in my mind, of turning up the volume. It was literally a statement, going out onto the streets and saying, well, if you don't see me walking down the street, you'll hear me, and that is an invitation for you to look at me, and I am owning my place in the street. That's what the work's about.
Wonderful. Yeah. How did you feel? Did you still feel vulnerable, or did you feel
Oh my God, very.
emboldened, or yeah?
I think it's a mixture of two things: empowered, very much so, but also very vulnerable. So the performance started in the theater, inside a safe space. Halfway through, I invited the audience to go out, and that moment, I had to kind of really psych myself up to go out, because I knew I was going to be in a public space, and that invites comments, it invites looks, it invites insults, it invites people threw things at me on the street. But of course, the purpose of the performance was to frame exactly that, which we as queer people see on a daily basis. We always see that. The moment I step out of my front door, I encounter that. So the performance was a way to frame that so the audience could see it happening in front of their eyes. And it was successful in that way. Of course, there was some things that we did in order to protect ourselves. You know, we're safe in numbers. The first time I went out into the street, it was really interesting because I had to test this. So do a run before an audience, but I still had a group of people with me. So I went out, turned a corner, just myself. There was a gang of men who were laughing and pointing at me, walking towards me in an aggressive way. The moment the band turned the corner, they stepped back, and their eyes, and that moment felt really empowering. It felt like, my gang is bigger than yours. And this has been caught on camera now. So it's kind of, that's what the work's about.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. So yeah, to get a little bit more academic, I find gender terminology thing to be, you know, a minefield, and especially with the pronoun thing. So I'm just wondering, you're very tied to effeminacy as a term and sissy.
Yes.
So could you talk a little bit about terminology?
Yes, of course. It's an interesting thing. I agree with you. It's kind of in an effort to disrupt and break fixed boundaries, you kind of create another one, create another label. So I've always tried to remain fluid, I suppose is the word. Effeminacy to me reflects this misalignment, is what I call. Misalignment between my male body and my effeminate agenda, and I use effeminate in a very specific way because effeminacy means approximating femininity. So it means you're not feminine, you're failing at femininity, and it also means you're failing at masculinity. So you're failing at gender in general. So that I find attractive about effeminacy because it is embracing failure. And cis is a word that I used for my PhD. I encountered it in my PhD, and it was something that came out of using an academic term. It's a queer reverse discourse. So the reverse discourse of cis is trying to embrace all the negative aspects of that term and turn them around, make them positive. Whenever I used the term in academic conferences, there was always a giggle in the room because it's such a term that's very childish, perhaps, and infantile and puerile, but playful. And I like that it disrupts the seriousness of academia, perhaps. Yeah.
Okay, so to go back to, you know, the experience that you began with, a lot of people claim that hate crimes or prejudice against effeminate men is just another example of misogyny. Do you agree with that?
I think it's a very fine line. There are similarities, but it's not the same thing, obviously, because the experiences of women are different from the experiences that I have as an effeminate man. So I'm not going to say it's the same because it's not the same. They're different. But I do see a similarity in the hatred against the effeminate, the fragile, the vulnerable. There's something about my appearance that attracts attention. And you said something in your intro about femininity attracting positive attention and negative attention. I see that very much in my expression of gender, and so perhaps that is similar to what you're saying, misogyny, the hatred of effeminacy. There's something about the way that I look that people say, you're obviously a man, and there's something that I find interesting. There's a paradox in the makeup and the nails that make me more masculine in a way, because it kind of makes me obviously male, the body is male, but those things are not sitting right, they're misaligned. So there's perhaps that's something is what I'm saying. The negative attention is you're obviously a man, but you're not acting like a man. You're not doing things that men should do. So what are you? You're not a woman either. So there's this confusion, which is the negative attention. Maybe that's kind of the similarity of trying to understand perhaps what is this. Why do you want to be feminine if you're a man? That's what it is, I guess.
Thank you for being so articulate about that and so open. Let's give Nando another round of applause. I'm really excited to introduce my next guest. She is a woman to be reckoned with. She's built a life against the odds. She's a mother, a domestic worker, and a fearless advocate for her fellow domestic workers, and to end modern slavery. She is the founder of the Voice of Domestic Workers. Please put your hands together for Marissa Begonia. So nice to meet you. Thank you for
Good
being
to be here. Thank you for having me.
So can you tell us the backstory? Why did you become a domestic worker?
Yeah. So I came from the Philippines, and I started to think of working when I became a mother. And when I had my second child, I just think I needed to stop giving birth so I could work. So I went to see the doctor and asked for ligation. And I told lies because at the time in the Philippines, we're only allowed to have ligation if we have 3 children. So I lied because I wanted so much to work to support my children. But because the doctor could see that and I didn't know that, so you actually had 2 children only. So then I had, but also I thought of that because, men, whenever they wanted it, to have sex with you they do it even if we didn't want to. So for a husband and wife, it's not considered as rape. But it's part of it. But so I had to do that. And so when I had my 3rd child, many women are leaving the country to work abroad. And because of the demand as well of the domestic work abroad, it was a difficult decision. It was very tough. I had 3 children at that time, 3 to 1 years old, and very little children. But what was also painful, whenever they cried, they asked for something, and I couldn't provide it. I couldn't give it, even it just cost 1 peso at that time. And when I saw the father is also not doing, is not being responsible, to be a family man. So I know I had to be responsible, So what pushed me really is the love and the responsibility as a mother. And so I first worked in Singapore. It was hard. That was 1994. It was really hard because there was not much. Unlike today, there's technology, that communication that is possible to get near your children. But at that time, there was only letters, and I only had 1 month day off at the time. And even as I was sleeping, I had to get their photos and look at them and hug me when I was sleeping. And eating was very hard. In 1 bite of bread, I need to have more water to push it inside because I know I had to survive. If something happened to me, I don't know what would happen to my children as well. So I had that in my heart all the time. Yeah.
So can you say a bit more about your experience with your relationship with your employers?
It's not as anyone could imagine because we work in a home where it should be the happiest and safest workplace could be, but not for us, many domestic workers. So I have had many bad experiences, and it's a situation of sometimes I had to put up because I had a family to feed back home. And I know whenever I left the country, I was also on loan. And my children my family are the one being held like hostage. Because if we don't pay, they will do something bad to my children. So we like it or not, we had to pay, to finish paying the 6 months salary deduction. Somehow what is stopping us to fight back in the first place and put up with the abuse. So we have to bear that we are always being shouted at for every little mistakes or wherever the family is stressed. And we had to even doing that. So on the door, that is like shouting is not enough. We still do like that. We still throw things at you. And then I think the most also difficult part is we are often accused of harming their child. So a child actually that we love like our own because we miss our own children, And but I had to put up every day until I finished paying my loan. I had this German employer who, on the first day of my employment, gave me a reflexology book. So I know that's a massage, and I know it's not part of my contract, terms and conditions, but I had to do it, otherwise I will lose job again. So one day he called me, Marisa, follow me in the room. But I wasn't expecting what was going in front of me was a naked man. And I was scared, I didn't know what to do, actually. I was just shaking. And then the house was so high. I said, if I jump the window, I wouldn't survive. If I shout, no one could hear me. And so, you know what? I'm going to do the best massage ever. I read this in the book. But I was at the same time angry, very angry, because I'm not a sex object, I'm not a slave that he could do anything he wanted to do with me at that time. I was angry, I was scared, but I knew at that time I need to protect myself. So I said, sir, this is the best massage ever. That was very strong, and he said, ouch, very pain. Oh, I said, sir, the more pain, the more good. Let's do it again. One more time. And say, get out, But, I wasn't safe yet, I need to grab knife, write resignation letter. And he saw me again in the morning. Oh, I'm sorry, Marisa. Oh, you're not sorry. This is what you've been doing to me, to my fellow domestic workers. This is what you are. And here's my resignation letter. Dear sir, I'm resigning with effect today because you're a sex maniac. What, Marisa? Can you change it? I said, no, I'm not going to change that. That's my reason. That's why I'm leaving. And you need to give me everything. And I'm off. So, so it's a very hidden, isolated work that we do, that if we don't get out and talk about it, no one really knows what's happening behind closed doors.
So I can see why you started the Voice of Domestic Workers, but can you say a bit more about how it actually came about? How did you make it happen?
So in London, I've seen so many, fellow domestic workers who suffered, when we started the Voice of Domestic Workers. It was called Justice for Domestic Workers at the beginning, because that's what we need, justice. And but later in last year, we changed it when we registered it as charity to the Voice of Domestic Workers. So we are now called the Voice of Domestic Workers. So at the beginning, I've seen, fellow domestic workers with bruises, with body poured with hot water, that were raped. It's just shocked me, to find out that this is actually happening. I thought I was the only one. And so I thought individually we're very weak. Because at that time I may have the courage to find ways to protect myself, but not many were able to protect themselves and been raped. And so we began to organize ourselves, and then we also provide classes, IT, English, so they are not cheated with their salary. They could read what they're writing a contract. And then we also do some body and wellness workshop to help them, Sometimes I tell my story, I still have this pain, that I feel every now and then. So recovering from that trauma was very difficult, especially also for my fellow domestic workers. And I thought I've seen what I say is worse than I have suffered. And so we began to also campaign and lobby the government, for a change, that this shouldn't be happening to women, So domestic workers are mostly women, and especially their mothers like me, and thinking of how many of them as well leaving the country until today is so many of them. And so we began to lobby the government and for some policy change. If you heard the Modern Slavery Act, we fought so hard with that. But they describe it as prevention, protection, and prosecution. Prevention, my opposition was that if the government is serious about prevention of the modern slavery and trafficking, then they shouldn't remove the rights of the domestic workers, because having able to change the employer to renew the visa, because that was how I was able to rebuild my life and able to settle, if they want to. Not everyone would want to settle her, but at least it is there whenever we need it. So when I came out from abusive employer, it was there. And now in 2012, the government removed all these rights that I used to have: the right to change employer, the right to renew the visa, the right to settlement. And we only managed to advance in Modern Slavery Act the right to change employer. But being able to change employer within 6 months only and not allowing domestic workers to renew the visa after these 6 months, it doesn't make any sense. It's very useless, because it doesn't. Who employer will employ a domestic worker with just 6 months visa? If they run away, if they manage to escape from abusive employment, let's say after 3 months, then they only had 3 months. How are they going to find job and able to claim? So many unpaid salaries, and one of the work that we've been doing is not actually a work. It's like we became an agent, like 007. Early this Monday, I've just rescued one, and I was contacted by one in the hotel was being beaten, and when I contacted her and I talked to her, she's being locked in the room. So I know I had to move quicker. So early in the morning, I had to go in that hotel. And I was even prepared to call a police if I had to, if the employer refused to let her go. Modern slavery, many people are talking about it, but actually it's just around us. It's just in the park, in the hotel. It could be in their neighborhood, but it's just many are not aware of that this is actually happening in London. And without a policy that would protect them, because I have no objection about the trafficking law, but we have to prove we needed to be raped, to be beaten, to be starved to death to access protection. That's how I define the Modern Slavery Act and the trafficking law for the migrant domestic workers. And we needed some policy that recognized domestic workers as workers, that we could claim our unpaid salaries, unpaid holidays, unpaid day off, when working 24 hours, working 7 days a week is not abuse, because it's so hard to prove that.
Yeah.
And the only abuse we could prove is we've been raped, we've been beaten, because it could see, it could, and if we've been starved, we're very skinny. There was even a domestic workers who could go in the cat flap. That's how it's skinny, because she's been starved. I'm not sure how this. We're in this modern century, but the slavery before is very much alive today. Employers should think that when they go out to work, so domestic work is the beginning of all work. It is actually the fuel that makes everybody work. They could work because of us, domestic workers. And therefore, if the employers are working, let's say overtime, the domestic workers are also overtime, because they couldn't rest unless they come back. But that's when they are paid in their overtime, they should also recognize that they also have to pay the domestic workers equally. And more often also, I don't know why, they come home, they say they socialize, they had parties, they had the domestic or look after the children, the house. Why they couldn't bring a key to open the door? Why they need to doorbell and wake up the domestic or call the domestic worker to open the door? Why they couldn't open the door? And that waiting hours is still unpaid. And that has to change. And many, is very much undervalued work and very much unrecognized, very much not treated, as work, but you see, looking after children, we're looking after your most precious children, your most precious mothers, the elderly. Your wealth is your household. They're doing this multitask. Is not a work. They call this as the lowest skilled work. I say, I would rather call this as multi-skilled work, performing all these tasks. You need that skilled and knowledge to be able to look after, to be able to read the medication. Even the elderly, we have to do the injection, provide the medicine. So how could they not call that a skilled work? It's a multi-skilled work.
Yeah. Yeah, it's totally down to a kind of devaluing of domestic work and work that happens in the home, work that's traditionally feminine. And yeah, speaking of precious children, what has happened with your children? It's my last question.
Yeah. Although I managed to give everything they needed back home, but my most wish or dream at that time was to be a normal mother. For me, it's not normal that I'm far away and sending them money, sending them package of everything, see them happy, but actually there's no contact between us, the mother and children relationship, When I got my settlement visa, I applied for my children to join me here. It wasn't easy. I still need to fight in court, to get my children here. But I won that. I won the appeal, and they finally joined me here. It wasn't easy because I had to admit that they didn't know me, and I didn't know them as well. So it's just I could now feel, the motherhood. To me, that's a normal mother, that I could both work, go home, and they're there, look after them. Although they weren't very children at that time, because they're already, when I managed to bring them here, they're around, it's a 17 years separation. They were already around, although I applied for them before they turned 18, but when I finished the court case, was already they're over 18. So, and then I always talk about my children, and people think it's just a little children. Well, actually, they are already young adult, but they're my most precious, and I think they are the very reason why I also survive this day. And the work that I have been doing, although I'm a domestic worker, I'm a mother, and I have an organization, but it's the fulfilling is seeing my fellow domestic workers able to stand up and speak out to public, To me, that's what gave me back. So imagine how much they suffered, and for them to be able to rebuild their lives, help them rebuild their lives. To me, that's what I've got. My happiness in doing this, although it's a lot of work, but it's my life. It's been part of my life, and I wouldn't survive without it as well.
It's been amazing to hear your story. Thank you all so much for being here and for being so open and articulate and wonderful. I just have some closing remarks. We are here today taking stock of femininity because it feels like we're on the precipice of change. As that change in the Merriam-Webster dictionary portends. But I think it's really important to remember that femininity has always been in flux because it's always been contingent on norms and ideals that we collectively uphold. So I want us to forge ahead and push the envelope. Is that the expression? Break the, yeah, push the envelope. But also, I think it's really important that we join together to cross social boundaries and to challenge those divides and to find commonality in uncommonness. That's what femininity at its best is good for. Thank you.
It was the O Show, the show with the O. It was the O Show, the show with the O. We talked and talked and talked and talked. Now we're out of time. It was the O Show. It was the O Show.